Warmly welcome to this seminar on apologetics in Christian mission in Europe and beyond. I'm Stefan Gustavsson from Apologia, Center for Christian Apologetics, based in Stockholm, Sweden. I'm so glad I can lead this seminar together with Julia Garschagen. And we are going to divide our time together into three parts. We will each give an introduction, and then we will give plenty of time for Q&A and conversation. Let me begin by giving some of the biblical background for Christian apologetics. One of the hallmarks of us as human beings is that we are questioning, asking beings. We ask questions about life. We wonder about our existence, our identity, about the meaning of our time here on earth, and what happens when our time is over. We ask questions. Now, in terms of apologetics, it relates to this aspect of who we are. And of course, if there is a God, He is the one who has made us this way, that we are looking for answers, looking for knowledge, looking for understanding and coherence. Apologetics relates to this. Not in terms of being a highly technical discipline, dealing with sophisticated philosophical issues only. No, much more in terms of a basic attitude. If you look at this fellow, this is someone with an attitude. Now, when I think of apologetics, I think of a broad attitude, not this kind of arrogance, but an attitude of looking for truth, investigating, searching, being open to analyze, to receive information, and to move forward in a search for truth. Apologetics is a broad concept of trying to understand what we do on this planet and how the Christian faith relates to our lives. All through the Bible, we are actually invited to search for truth. We can see that in the Gospels. Here's a passage from Luke 12, where Jesus is highly critical towards his own contemporaries, saying, "Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. You know how to interpret the weather. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? Why are you not eager to understand your own culture or own time?" And of course, in this situation, the identity of the person who had entered that culture and that time. Or take John 7:24, where Jesus again is challenging his contemporary, saying, "Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Don't be so shallow in your analysis, in your thinking, in your response, but dig deeper. Judge correctly." All this, of course, for Jesus flows from the great commandment, the greatest of the commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. God is the one who has given us our ability to think and reflect, and we should involve that in our love for God. And we can see in Jesus' life and ministry that he was constantly involved in conversation and dialogue and debate, and that he answered questions and he himself asked very probing questions, challenging people, forcing people to start to think and reflect and reevaluate their own life. If we go to the letters in the New Testament, we will find that too. Here's an example from Colossians 4. Paul is talking about the communication of the gospel, and he asks for prayer, that God may open a door for our message so that we can proclaim the mystery of Christ, the mystery that is now revealed. So he is proclaiming the gospel of Christ, and he wants us to pray that God will open doors for that message. But he then goes on to challenge all the Christians in Colossae, saying, let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Here's an interesting picture. We are called, like Paul, to proclaim the gospel of Christ. But we are also called to go into conversations. So proclamation and conversation needs to go hand in hand. And we need, as disciples, to grow in our ability to answer the questions from people around us. When Paul is talking about the leadership in the church, he is identifying a number of qualifications. And here's one of them from Titus 1:19, that the leadership must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refuse those who oppose it. So the leadership needs to hold on to the trustworthy message, to the truth of the gospel that we have been taught all the way back from Jesus and the apostles, so that we, out from that truth, can encourage others that is within the church by sound doctrine to help Christians. So that is apologetics inwardly to the Christian community. And then to refuse those who oppose it, to answer the objections and criticism. So that is apologetics in relationship to the outside world, those who are not part of the Christian community. So we are called to hold on to the truth, to encourage each other with that truth, and also to refute objections and criticism and misunderstandings and prejudices against the gospel. That's an important part of Christian leadership. No one has formulated this clearer than Peter in this well-known passage in 1 Peter 3, verse 15. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Always be prepared to give an answer, to give a reason. This is one of the 18 places in the New Testament where we find the Greek word apologia, which is of course behind our word apologetics. In the letter, this is put in the context of our full life. In the verse before, Peter has talked about setting Christ apart in our hearts. And he continues to talk about being humble and respectful and of a good behavior. So our full life is involved. Our heart, our life, but also our understanding, our mind. We should be prepared to give an answer, to give a reason. We find a wonderful illustration of this in Acts 17. Actually, we could find it all through the book of Acts. In Acts 17, when Paul is coming to Thessaloniki, Luke tells us this. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. In this summary of what Paul were doing in this 3-week mission in Thessaloniki, Luke is using 5 verbs that captures Paul's ministry. And if I take away all the other text, you see the 5 verbs here. He reasoned, explaining and proving, proclaiming, and it led to deep persuasion. So this is the apologetic calling to reason, to explain, to prove, to show the truth, to proclaim that message and help people to grow in persuasion about the truth of the gospel. Of course, every time, every culture, every place is different. And there are different objections, different criticism. So we need to be sensitive to the time where God has placed us, to the culture into which we are called to show the love of Christ and the truth of Christ. So there is not an easy copy and paste of what others have done. We need to be sensitive to our own culture and to the specific objections and the specific questions and the specific criticism that is launched against the gospel. But we need to do that with this apologetic attitude, an attitude looking for truth, searching for truth, growing in understanding. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your very concise summary of the biblical mandate for apologetic. As Stefan has already mentioned, my name is Julia Garschagen. I'm the director of the Pontus Institute for Science, Culture and Faith in the German-speaking countries. And it's my privilege to speak at universities and in the business world and to very often have very critical conversation with skeptics and agnostics, atheists. But before I dive into a bit more of an introduction to apologetics, I just want to say we are trying to keep this time very short, so that afterwards we've got more time for your questions. We thought as we are speaking about apologetics, we might just as well do it. So it's your task to please be thinking of questions that you have, critical questions that your friends might ask, and to post them into the chat so that later on we have the chance to get through as many as we can and try and answer them. Stefan has already very helpfully observed how in apologetics it is our task to observe the culture well and to think about the questions and objections that our society has in order to then give thoughtful and biblical answers to those objections. I think if we want to share the gospel today and to really show that it is relevant for today's culture, we need to know what the most pressing questions of our society are. We need to think about why do people think the way they are and how can we answer from a biblical perspective. Karl Barth, the famous Swiss theologian, once said, we need to keep the Bible in one hand and the newspaper, well, that was his time. Today we might say the smartphone or wherever you get your newsfeed from in the other hand. And then we need to interpret and read one through the lenses of the other. Over the last 10 years, I have really seen and observed a shift in culture. My feeling is that the strongest objections against Christianity are not so much the intellectual questions anymore. Yes, people still ask about science and faith and evolution and creation and all of that, but I think the more prominent questions and objections have become the moral questions. Like, why is there so much hypocrisy in the church? How can Christians be so arrogant to say there's only one way? Why are you homophobic and against women? What about climate change and racism? And why is the church so often not part of the solution, but part of the problem? What about artificial intelligence and all of those questions? So if we want to show that the gospel is relevant today, the task of the apologist is to answer thoughtfully those questions, those pressing issues. And I think we do that by firstly asking ourselves, what is the longing behind people's opinions? Why are people saying what they are saying? What is the question behind the question? Take, for example, the topic of abortion. For many Christians, the pressing issue behind the topic of abortion is the question of the value of life. And we say, well, life is worth everything. For most of my non-Christian friends, the pressing issue behind the topic of abortion is actually the question of the freedom of women. So if I deny abortion, they hear me denying the freedom of women. something else you don't want to do. And that's why we so often talk at cross purposes and we don't understand each other. We don't seem to come together. So I think our first task is to always ask ourselves, what is the question behind the question? And then secondly, we need to find out what is the positive longing behind this. Is there something that we can agree on from a biblical perspective? As I already said, for example, I'm all for the freedom of women, and I think Jesus is. So the question is, what is the best way to achieve that freedom? Or take relativism, for instance, the thought that all religions lead to the same God and that there is no absolute truth. The positive longing that many people have behind this is actually that they're seeking for harmony and peace in society. And they think, well, if we all agreed that we all had the same truth, then there wouldn't be any reason to argue anymore. And from a Christian point of view, I would want to say, yes, me too. I'm all for peace and reconciliation. Those are biblical values. We've got the same aim. We sit, so to say, in the same boat. So firstly, we need to ask, what is the longing behind the question? And then secondly, what can we agree on and strengthen from a biblical perspective? And then thirdly, our task is to tell the better story, to show why the gospel is life-giving. Why does it speak so life-givingly into that question? Take relativism again. Yes, we're all for freedom and peace in society, but then the question is, what is the best way of achieving this? And I want to say, well, if you look at Jesus, he said we should love our enemies and pray for those who are against us. And he didn't just say this and preach it, he also lived it. That is so much more than just mere tolerance. Then I want to say, well, I think in order to achieve a more peaceful society, we don't need less of Jesus, we need more of him. So yeah, it's very important that we are called to give an apologia, an apologetic. But First Peter also tells us that we should do so in gentleness and respect. And I think in today's culture, that's so crucial. Yes, it is important what we say, but it is just as important how we say it. And as always, it's very good to mirror Jesus in the way how he speaks to people. Jesus always spoke at truth and clarity, but he was also the most humble and respectful person that has ever been on this planet. And again, that's something we should mirror. So that means we shouldn't be arguing someone into the kingdom. People always need relationship. They need friendship and love, and they need to meet and experience the risen Jesus for themselves. So that means we are not called to bash people with arguments. We are not even called to win the argument. We are called to win the person, to win their heart and their mind. Apologetic is counseling for the mind. So let's speak in a way that it is counseling for people. Yes, we believe that Jesus is the truth, and that means he stands to any test. So we can welcome all questions, we can welcome all critical thinking. And even if we don't know the answer, that's completely okay. We can always say, I don't know it. Jesus did so himself when they came and asked him, when is the end of time? He said, only the Father knows, I don't. So that's okay. We don't know an answer. We can always say to the person, well, that's a great question. You know, I haven't even thought of it myself, but can I go back and ask someone else and do some research? And then maybe next week we can meet over coffee again. So you actually get a second chance to talk to that people. We are not called to be God's lawyers. We are called to be his witnesses. So it's okay not to know the answer of someone. And I think most importantly for us when we do apologetics is that we need to be aware for someone to become a Christian, it's always, always the task and the work of the Holy Spirit. Yes, we can argue and we hopefully do so in respect, but it's always the Holy Spirit who convinces people's heart and people's mind. But he does use us and he uses our arguments for that. So This is what we wanted to share briefly with you, but it's now your turn, and we're going to answer and try and answer as many questions as we can. Please keep typing in your critical questions. If you haven't thought of a question yet, you can do so now. Maybe you want to think about, you know, if a friend or a stranger comes to you and says, oh, I hear you are a Christian. There's one question I always wanted to ask a Christian. What is the question that you pray and say, please, please, Lord, not that question? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to hear from you. So please be typing them into the chat, and Stefan and I will now do our best to answer them. Thank you so much.